A badge can make a man feel powerful, but the moment he mistakes authority for invincibility, justice begins counting the seconds until everything changes. The heavy oak doors of the Jefferson County Courthouse swung open just after 9 on a gray Tuesday morning, and the building settled into its familiar rhythm of quiet footsteps, hushed conversations, and the distant echo of a judge's gavel somewhere beyond the marble hallways. Lawyers adjusted their ties, clerks carried thick folders from one courtroom to another, and deputies greeted familiar faces with practiced smiles that never quite reached their eyes. It looked like another ordinary morning, the kind where every person believed they already knew how the day would end. Officer Ethan Brooks certainly did. Wearing a spotless uniform and the polished silver badge he considered the most important part of his identity, Ethan moved through the courthouse with the confidence of someone who believed every hallway belonged to him. People stepped aside when they saw him coming, and each small gesture reinforced the dangerous certainty growing inside his mind. Respect had become something he expected instead of something he earned. Across the lobby, a woman quietly removed a pair of reading glasses before placing them inside a leather folder. Naomi Carter wore a navy suit without expensive jewelry or anything that invited attention. Her natural curls rested neatly against her shoulders, and her calm expression revealed nothing beyond quiet patience. She glanced toward the courtroom schedule mounted on the wall, thanked an elderly volunteer who pointed her toward courtroom 4, and continued walking with measured confidence. Several people noticed her, but only for a second, before returning to their own concerns. Ethan noticed her differently. His eyes narrowed the moment she approached the security checkpoint leading toward the courtroom corridor. Something about the composure in her walk irritated him, as though confidence itself required his approval. He stepped directly into her path before she reached the courtroom entrance. "Hold it," he said sharply enough that nearby conversations faded into silence. Naomi stopped immediately and looked at him without fear or hostility. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked in a calm voice that carried easily across the polished hallway. Ethan folded his arms and looked her up and down as though deciding whether she belonged inside the building at all. "People don't just wander into restricted courtrooms," he replied. "Who exactly are you here to see?" Naomi answered politely. "I'm expected inside courtroom 4. Ethan smirked, convinced he had already uncovered someone who didn't belong. Around them, courthouse staff slowed their pace. Attorneys paused halfway through conversations. A bailiff standing near the courtroom door quietly looked toward Ethan with growing concern. Naomi noticed none of the whispers. Or perhaps she noticed every single one and simply refused to let them disturb her. She tightened her grip on the leather folder and waited. She never argued. She never raised her voice. She simply stood there with remarkable composure, while Ethan mistook restraint for weakness. What he could not possibly know was that nearly every person walking through those marble hallways believed the trial beginning in courtroom 4 would expose one corrupt officer. None of them realized the real investigation had already begun long before anyone entered the courtroom. And the woman standing quietly in front of him was never the person who needed to prove she belonged there. Naomi Carter neither stepped backward nor attempted to move around Officer Ethan Brooks. Instead, she stood exactly where she was, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, her attention fixed on the man who believed every second of silence confirmed his authority. Around them, the courthouse continued moving, but its rhythm had changed. Conversations became whispers. Shoes clicked more slowly across the marble floor. A court reporter waiting outside courtroom 4 glanced at her watch before looking toward the growing crowd with quiet curiosity. Ethan noticed the attention and welcomed it. An audience made him feel even more certain that he was in complete control. "Identification," he demanded, extending his hand without taking his eyes off Naomi. She calmly reached into her leather folder instead of her purse, carefully removing a government-issued identification card inside a protective sleeve. Before she could fully present it, Ethan raised his hand. "Not so fast," he said. "People can carry all kinds of cards these days." Naomi lowered the identification without showing frustration. "If you would like to examine it, you are welcome to do so." Ethan gave a brief laugh that invited a few uncomfortable smiles from those standing nearby. "I will decide what I need to examine." His words echoed farther than he expected, bouncing off the stone walls of the corridor. A young deputy standing several feet away shifted uneasily but remained silent. An older bailiff near the courtroom entrance quietly watched the exchange, his expression growing more serious with every passing moment. Naomi noticed both men, offering neither a plea for help nor a complaint. She simply waited. The patience in her eyes unsettled Ethan far more than anger would have. Most people became defensive when challenged. Some argued. Others apologized even when they had done nothing wrong. Naomi did neither. She answered every question with quiet confidence, never matching his rising tone. That calmness felt almost unfamiliar inside a building where fear often filled the hallways. Ethan took another step closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal. "You expect me to believe someone like you has official business inside one of the biggest hearings this courthouse has seen all year?" Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "I expect you to treat every person with the same professionalism your badge represents." For the first time, Ethan's smile faded. The words were respectful, yet they landed with unexpected weight. Before he could respond, the large courtroom doors opened briefly as Assistant United States Attorney Monica Hayes exited with several case files in her arms. She paused after noticing the gathering crowd. Her eyes briefly met Naomi's before continuing down the hallway without saying a word. The exchange lasted less than 2 seconds, but the older bailiff noticed it immediately. So did another man standing near a column at the opposite end of the corridor. Dressed in a dark suit, Federal Marshal Daniel Ross appeared to be reading messages on his phone, yet his attention never truly left the unfolding scene. He made no attempt to interrupt. He simply observed, as though waiting for something only he understood. Ethan remained completely unaware. Convinced that every silent witness supported his actions, he folded his arms once again and blocked the entrance to courtroom 4. Behind the closed doors, the judge was only minutes away from calling the session to order. Outside those doors, another proceeding had already begun, one without a jury, without opening statements, and without anyone realizing that every decision made in this hallway was quietly shaping the outcome of a far greater case than the one waiting inside. The hallway clock clicked another minute forward, yet no one seemed eager to move. It was as though the entire courthouse had quietly accepted that something unusual was unfolding just outside courtroom 4. Judge Harold Whitmore had not yet taken the bench, but word was already spreading among clerks and deputies that the hearing would begin late. No explanation had been announced. No emergency had been reported. Still, experienced courthouse employees sensed that invisible currents often carried more weight than official schedules. Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had been standing, holding her leather folder close without clutching it nervously. Her expression never changed, even as curious eyes settled upon her from every direction. She had spent years learning that patience often revealed more about another person than confrontation ever could. Every unnecessary question, every assumption, every careless remark had a way of exposing character all by itself. Officer Ethan Brooks interpreted her silence differently. To him, it confirmed that she had nowhere else to go. He looked toward several deputies standing nearby, almost inviting their approval. None of them spoke. One quietly adjusted his duty belt before looking away. Another pretended to review paperwork that had already been signed. Their silence was not agreement. It was uncertainty. Ethan simply failed to recognize the difference. "Courtroom 4 is not open to spectators," he announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Especially not during a federal proceeding." Naomi answered with the same calm voice that had never once risen above conversation level. "Then it is fortunate that I am not here as a spectator." A faint murmur moved through the hallway. Ethan smiled as though he had heard an amusing joke. Everyone suddenly has an important reason when they get stopped. Naomi nodded slightly. Sometimes they do. The simplicity of her answer frustrated him far more than an argument would have. He expected resistance. He expected excuses. Instead, every response forced him to speak longer while she spoke less. Across the corridor, Federal Marshal Daniel Ross finally slipped his phone into his jacket pocket. His attention remained fixed on the exchange, but his face revealed nothing. He neither approached nor interrupted. Several feet away, Assistant United States Attorney Monica Hayes returned carrying another stack of files. As she passed, her eyes lingered for only a brief moment on Naomi before continuing toward another courtroom. Ethan noticed the glance but misunderstood its meaning. He assumed Monica was watching because she expected him to resolve the situation quickly. What he did not realize was that experienced attorneys often recognized people without acknowledging them publicly. Near the security station, an elderly maintenance worker slowly pushed a supply cart through the corridor before stopping beside Naomi. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I believe you dropped this." He handed her a simple blue ink pen that had slipped unnoticed from the edge of her folder. Naomi smiled warmly. "Thank you. I appreciate your kindness." The man nodded before quietly moving on. It lasted only a few seconds, but the exchange changed the atmosphere in a way Ethan could not explain. The maintenance worker had spoken to Naomi with natural respect, as though he recognized something others had overlooked. A young law student waiting outside the courtroom whispered to her classmate, "She does not seem nervous at all." Her friend answered softly, "She looks like someone who already knows how this ends." Ethan heard neither comment. His confidence had become so complete that it filtered out everything except his own assumptions. Somewhere beyond the courtroom doors, the sound of a gavel echoed once, followed by complete silence. It was the signal that the judge had entered the courtroom. The hearing everyone had been waiting for was about to begin. Yet outside those doors, another judgment was quietly taking shape, one built not on testimony or evidence presented inside the courtroom, but on choices being made in plain sight by a man who still believed nobody was watching closely enough to remember every word he said. The courtroom doors remained closed, but the hallway outside had become a stage where every passing second carried more weight than anyone realized. Officer Ethan Brooks glanced toward the wall clock before looking back at Naomi Carter with growing impatience. The hearing had already been delayed, and instead of questioning whether his own actions might be contributing to the situation, he convinced himself that she was responsible for every inconvenience. Confidence slowly hardened into arrogance, and arrogance began shaping every word that left his mouth. "You are holding up federal business," he declared loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear him. "If you had simply followed instructions, we would not still be standing here." Naomi answered without hesitation. "I have followed every lawful instruction you have given." Her calm response caused several people in the hallway to exchange quiet glances. Ethan immediately spoke over her. "That is not for you to decide." His voice echoed across the marble corridor, drawing even more attention from attorneys leaving neighboring courtrooms. Some slowed their pace, pretending to organize documents while discreetly observing the confrontation. Others simply stopped altogether, sensing that something important was unfolding. Naomi remained composed. She neither challenged his authority nor attempted to embarrass him in return. Instead, she held the leather folder comfortably against her side and waited for him to finish speaking. Her restraint only deepened Ethan's frustration. He wanted emotion. He wanted an argument. He wanted proof that his assumptions were justified. Instead, every measured answer made his own reactions appear increasingly unreasonable. "You expect everyone here to believe you belong inside that courtroom," Ethan said with another dismissive smile. "People cannot simply walk into a federal proceeding because they say they have business there." Naomi met his eyes steadily. "That is true. Which is why people are usually verified before conclusions are made." The words were respectful, yet several courthouse employees quietly lowered their eyes. An experienced court clerk standing near the security desk sighed almost imperceptibly. She had worked inside the courthouse for nearly 20 years and had seen enough difficult mornings to recognize when patience was running out, although not from the person most people expected. Federal Marshal Daniel Ross remained motionless near the stone column, quietly observing every exchange without once interrupting. He glanced briefly toward his watch before returning his attention to Ethan. The older bailiff at the courtroom entrance noticed the movement and instinctively straightened his uniform. Something told him the next few minutes would matter. Ethan interpreted the growing silence as support. He stepped directly in front of the courtroom entrance once again, making it unmistakably clear that Naomi would not be passing through while he remained there. "You are going to wait right here until I decide otherwise," he announced. Naomi gave a slight nod. "If that is your decision, officer, I will wait." The answer caught him off guard. There was no sarcasm. No visible resentment. Only quiet confidence. Somewhere inside courtroom 4, another gavel struck once, followed by muffled voices that quickly faded again. The hearing was still waiting to begin. Outside, the hallway had become almost completely silent. Even those pretending not to watch had stopped pretending. Every unnecessary delay, every public remark, every confident assumption was quietly settling into the memory of everyone present. Ethan believed he was demonstrating control before an audience. He never considered that the same audience might later become witnesses to something far more significant than the case scheduled inside the courtroom. The silence stretching across the courthouse hallway was no longer ordinary. It had become the kind of silence that appears when experienced professionals sense that a single decision is about to change everything. Officer Ethan Brooks remained convinced he was controlling the situation, but the smallest details around him were beginning to tell a different story. A courthouse clerk quietly closed the file she had been reviewing without taking her eyes off the hallway. A deputy standing near the security station subtly adjusted the radio on his shoulder, although no message had come through. Federal Marshal Daniel Ross glanced once more toward the entrance before checking the time with calm precision. None of them appeared alarmed. They simply seemed to be waiting. Naomi Carter noticed every movement without openly acknowledging any of it. Her leather folder rested comfortably in one hand, and the blue pen the maintenance worker had returned moments earlier remained clipped neatly inside. She looked toward the courtroom doors for only a brief second before returning her attention to Ethan. There was no impatience on her face, only quiet certainty, as though delays no longer mattered to her. Ethan interpreted that certainty as defiance. "You seem remarkably comfortable for someone who cannot explain why she belongs here," he remarked. Naomi answered softly. "Sometimes explanations are more effective when everyone who needs to hear them is present." Ethan laughed under his breath. "That sounds mysterious." "No," Naomi replied. "Only timely." Before Ethan could respond, the elevator at the end of the corridor opened with a gentle chime. 3 men wearing dark business suits stepped into the hallway carrying slim black portfolios. They were not dressed like attorneys, nor did they resemble ordinary courthouse visitors. Without speaking to anyone, they walked past the security station with measured confidence before stopping several yards away. One quietly exchanged a nod with Federal Marshal Daniel Ross. The gesture lasted less than a second, yet the older bailiff noticed it immediately. Ethan did not. His attention remained fixed entirely on Naomi. Across the hallway, Assistant United States Attorney Monica Hayes emerged once again, this time carrying only a single sealed folder marked with a bright red security label. She paused beside a clerk, signed one document, then carefully placed the sealed folder onto a nearby evidence cart instead of taking it into the courtroom. The label caught Naomi's attention for only an instant before she looked away. Ethan noticed her brief glance and assumed she had become nervous. "Interesting," he said with a satisfied smile. "Finally found something worth worrying about?" Naomi shook her head gently. "Not at all." "Then what were you looking at?" Ethan asked. "A reminder," she answered. "That every document eventually reaches the right hands." Those words settled heavily over the corridor. The clerk who had been organizing files stopped writing for just a moment. The deputy near the security station slowly lifted his eyes toward Daniel Ross. Even the maintenance worker, now farther down the hallway, paused beside his supply cart before quietly continuing on. None of them understood the full picture, yet each sensed that invisible pieces were moving into place. Ethan remained completely unaware. To him, the hallway still revolved around his authority, his questions, and his decisions. He never realized that while he focused entirely on one woman standing calmly before him, others had already begun noticing something far more important. They were no longer watching Naomi to discover who she was. They were watching Ethan to see how much further he was willing to go before the truth arrived on its own. Officer Ethan Brooks had stopped asking questions because he genuinely wanted answers. By now, every sentence he spoke had become an attempt to prove that his first assumption had been correct. He believed that admitting even the smallest mistake would weaken the authority he had spent years building inside these courthouse walls. Naomi Carter understood that long before she ever walked through the front entrance that morning. She had encountered the same certainty before, not only in courtrooms but in conference rooms, government buildings, and quiet interviews where confidence too often replaced careful judgment. That was why she remained perfectly composed. Every unnecessary word spoken around her became another piece of a much larger picture. Ethan looked toward the three men in dark suits waiting farther down the hallway before turning back to Naomi. "Are they with you?" he asked. Naomi followed his gaze only briefly. "You would have to ask them." "I asked you. And I answered honestly." Ethan exhaled sharply. Her calm precision made every exchange feel strangely unbalanced. He had expected nervous explanations, not measured restraint. Around them, the hallway remained unusually quiet. Court personnel continued moving from office to office, but each person seemed to glance toward the same small group before continuing on. The hearing inside courtroom for still had not begun. Judge Harold Whitmore had delayed taking testimony, and even that unusual decision seemed to pass without complaint. Those familiar with federal proceedings understood that delays rarely happened without purpose. Federal Marshal Daniel Ross finally stepped away from the stone column and walked slowly toward a nearby window overlooking the courthouse plaza. He appeared to admire the morning skyline, but his reflection in the glass continued watching the corridor behind him. One of the suited men quietly handed him a sealed envelope. Daniel accepted it without opening it, slipping it inside his jacket as naturally as someone receiving routine paperwork. Ethan never noticed. His attention remained fixed on Naomi, convinced she was still the center of the situation. In reality, she had quietly become the calmest person in a hallway where everyone else was beginning to recognize invisible pieces connecting together. Ethan folded his arms once again. "You still have not explained why you are here." Naomi answered without hesitation. "Because this is where I was instructed to be." "By whom?" Ethan asked immediately. Naomi looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "The answer to that question is only a few minutes away." Something about those words caused even the deputy standing near the security station to lift his head. Ethan forced another smile, although this one carried less confidence than before. "You really enjoy speaking in riddles?" Naomi shook her head gently. "No, Officer Brooks. I simply understand that timing matters." At that exact moment, the courthouse public address system quietly announced that all personnel assigned to courtroom for should remain available for immediate instructions. No explanation followed. Several attorneys exchanged puzzled looks. Assistant United States Attorney Monica Hayes closed the sealed folder on the evidence cart and stepped closer to the courtroom entrance without opening the doors. Federal Marshal Daniel Ross checked his watch one final time before giving an almost imperceptible nod to the three suited men. None of them moved toward Naomi. None of them addressed Ethan. They simply waited with the calm confidence of people who already knew the next chapter had arrived. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly to the leather folder in her hand before looking back at Ethan. Her voice remained steady, almost compassionate. "Officer Brooks, you are making this much harder for yourself than it ever needed to be." For the first time that morning, Ethan did not answer immediately. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet doubt had finally appeared, small enough to ignore, yet impossible to silence completely. The quiet doubt inside Officer Ethan Brooks disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Pride pushed it aside before reason had the chance to grow. He straightened his uniform, adjusted the silver badge on his chest, and convinced himself that confidence alone could silence whatever uncertainty had begun creeping into the hallway. Around him, however, the atmosphere had already changed. The courthouse no longer felt like a place waiting for a hearing to begin. It felt like a place waiting for the truth to enter the room. Without warning, the double doors leading to the administrative corridor opened. 3 federal agents dressed in dark suits walked forward with calm purpose, followed by Federal Marshal Daniel Ross. Their footsteps echoed across the marble floor, instantly drawing every pair of eyes in the hallway. Conversation stopped. Clerks set down their files. Even the deputies standing near the security station instinctively stepped aside without being asked. Ethan frowned as the group approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, expecting the familiar authority of his uniform to control the conversation. Daniel Ross looked directly at him but answered with complete composure. "Not at the moment, Officer Brooks." Then, without another word, he walked past Ethan and stopped directly in front of Naomi Carter. The entire hallway seemed to hold its breath. Daniel offered a respectful nod before speaking clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Good morning, Director Carter. We apologize for the unexpected delay. Everything is ready inside." For several long seconds, nobody moved. Ethan stared at Naomi, waiting for someone to laugh, waiting for someone to explain that this had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Instead, the 3 federal agents stood quietly beside Daniel Ross, each acknowledging Naomi with the same professional respect. Assistant United States Attorney Monica Hayes stepped forward carrying the sealed folder that had remained untouched throughout the morning. She handed it directly to Naomi. "The final authorization arrived 5 minutes ago," Monica said. "The court is prepared to proceed under your direction." Naomi accepted the folder with the same calm expression she had worn since entering the courthouse. She thanked Monica with a simple nod before finally turning toward Ethan. There was no anger in her face. No satisfaction. Only quiet disappointment. "Officer Brooks," she said gently, "I gave you every opportunity to let professionalism guide this conversation." Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. His eye shifted from Naomi to Daniel Ross, then to Monica Hayes, then to the federal agent standing beside them. Every face reflected the same unmistakable truth. This was no performance. This was no misunderstanding. Daniel Ross finally addressed the growing crowd. "For those present, allow me to make a formal introduction. This is Naomi Carter, Director of the Federal Judicial Integrity Task Force and the supervising official assigned to today's confidential investigation." A wave of astonished whispers spread through the hallway. The deputy who had remained silent all morning slowly lowered his eyes. The experienced bailiff exhaled quietly, as though a question he had been carrying for hours had finally been answered. Even the maintenance worker paused beside his supply cart and smiled faintly before continuing his work. Naomi looked toward the courtroom doors as they slowly opened from the inside. Judge Harold Whitmore himself stepped into the hallway. The moment he saw Naomi, he walked directly toward her and extended his hand. "Director Carter," he said respectfully, "the court is ready whenever you are." Only then did Ethan truly understand what had happened. The woman he had questioned, delayed, and underestimated had never been trying to enter someone else's proceeding. She had been the person everyone inside the courthouse had been waiting for. Officer Ethan Brooks felt the weight of dozens of eyes long before anyone spoke another word. The confidence that had carried him through the morning disappeared beneath a silence far more powerful than any public accusation. Every assumption he had made now stood exposed without Naomi Carter needing to raise her voice even once. Judge Harold Whitmore stepped aside, allowing Naomi to enter courtroom for first. The federal agents followed with quiet discipline, while Assistant United States Attorney Monica Hayes carried the sealed evidence folder directly to the clerk's table. The spectators inside the courtroom, already wondering why the hearing had been delayed, immediately sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding. Naomi took her place near the front of the courtroom, not at the witness stand but beside the federal prosecution team. Judge Whitmore gave a single nod before addressing everyone present. "This court will now proceed under the authority of the Federal Judicial Integrity Task Force." The words echoed through the courtroom with unmistakable clarity. Ethan remained near the entrance, uncertain whether to stay or leave. Daniel Ross approached him with calm professionalism. "Officer Brooks, I ask that you remain available while today's proceedings continue." There was no anger in his voice. No humiliation. Only procedure. Ethan quietly nodded. For the first time that morning, he followed instructions without argument. Naomi opened the sealed folder and carefully removed several documents, each marked with official federal authorization. She placed them on the evidence table one by one. Alongside them were courthouse access logs, internal communications, sworn statements, security reports, and administrative records gathered over many months. Every document had been reviewed, verified, and organized long before anyone entered the building that morning. Judge Whitmore examined the first page before looking toward the courtroom. The purpose of today's hearing extends beyond the original matter scheduled on this calendar, he announced. Additional findings concerning courthouse conduct, procedural integrity, and professional accountability have now been entered into the record. A quiet murmur spread through the gallery before quickly fading. Naomi finally addressed the room. Her voice remained calm, measured, and respectful. Every institution depends upon public trust. That trust is protected not by titles or uniforms, but by consistent professionalism, fairness, and accountability. Today's review is not about one difficult conversation. It is about ensuring that every person who enters this courthouse is treated according to the same standard. No one interrupted her. The attorneys listened carefully. The deputies stood motionless. Even experienced reporters lowered their pens for a brief moment before continuing their notes. Ethan watched silently from the doorway as pieces of the morning finally connected in his mind. The unexpected delays. The sealed folder. The federal agents. The unusual attention from courthouse staff. None of it had been random. The hallway itself had quietly become part of a much larger review already authorized before sunrise. Daniel Ross handed one additional document to the court clerk, who immediately entered it into the official record. The document confirmed that observations made outside courtroom for earlier that morning would be preserved alongside the investigation's findings for administrative evaluation. No dramatic announcement followed. No raised voices filled the courtroom. Instead, the process moved forward with the quiet precision expected inside a place built to protect justice. As Naomi closed the final folder and looked across the courtroom, it became unmistakably clear that real authority had never come from speaking the loudest. It had come from allowing patience, preparation, and the truth to speak when the right moment finally arrived. The proceedings continued for several hours, not with dramatic confrontations or emotional speeches, but with careful review, verified records, and patient testimony. Every document Naomi Carter had placed before the court fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been assembled long before that Tuesday morning. Procedures were examined, administrative practices were reviewed, and recommendations for additional oversight were formally entered into the record. The purpose had never been to embarrass individuals. It had always been to strengthen the institution entrusted with delivering justice. As the hearing concluded, Judge Harold Whitmore thanked every federal official, courthouse employee, and member of the public who had cooperated throughout the investigation. He reminded everyone present that accountability was not a punishment reserved for difficult moments but a responsibility shared by every person who served the law. His words settled quietly across the courtroom, carrying more weight than any raised voice ever could. Officer Ethan Brooks remained seated until nearly everyone else had left. The confidence that had defined him earlier that morning had been replaced by thoughtful silence. For the first time in many years, he replayed ordinary conversations in his mind, wondering how many assumptions he had mistaken for certainty. Daniel Ross approached him before leaving the courtroom. He did not lecture him. He simply said, "Every professional receives moments that define a career. The important question is what you choose to learn afterward." Ethan slowly nodded. There was nothing to argue with. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun reflected across the marble steps where people quietly resumed their normal routines. Attorneys hurried toward nearby offices. Families embraced after hearings had ended. Reporters packed away cameras and notebooks. Life continued, just as it always did after a long day inside a courthouse. Naomi stepped through the front entrance carrying the same leather folder she had held all morning. Waiting near the bottom of the steps was the elderly maintenance worker who had returned her blue pen hours earlier. He smiled warmly as she approached. "Looks like everything worked out," he said. Naomi smiled back. "Because people like you never stop treating others with respect." The man tipped his cap before returning to work, pushing his supply cart toward another entrance without expecting recognition. Naomi watched him for a moment before walking toward the sidewalk. As she reached the corner, she noticed a young girl holding her mother's hand while staring back at the courthouse with quiet curiosity. The little girl looked at Naomi and asked, "Are you the lady everyone was waiting for?" Naomi paused, then knelt just enough to meet the child's eyes with a gentle smile. "No," she answered softly. "I am just someone who believed every person deserves to be treated fairly." The little girl smiled and waved before continuing down the sidewalk with her mother. Naomi stood there for another moment, looking back at the courthouse where the morning had begun with assumptions and ended with understanding. The building itself had not changed. The marble columns were the same. The courtroom doors were the same. The badges, robes, and official seals remained exactly where they had always been. What had changed was a simple reminder carried by everyone who witnessed that day. Authority may open doors, but character determines what happens after you walk through them. A title can command attention for a moment. Respect must be earned every single day. And the strongest form of justice is never the loudest voice in the room. It is the quiet truth that remains standing long after every assumption has finally fallen silent.